At dawn on August 9, 1942, American Marines stood on the beaches of Guadalcanal and watched their navy disappear. One by one, the ships turned away from the island. Destroyers, cruisers, transports still half full of supplies. They gathered speed, pointed their bows toward open water, and vanished beyond the horizon. No speeches were made, no explanations shouted across the water, just the low rumble of engines fading into the morning air. The Marines understood immediately what this meant. The night before, the U.S. Navy had suffered one of the worst defeats in its history. Off Savo Island, in the dark waters just north of Guadalcanal, Japanese warships had torn apart an Allied task force in minutes. 4 heavy cruisers were sunk, over 1,000 sailors were dead. Now the fleet was pulling back, not out of choice, but out of fear. Fear of Japanese bombers from Rabaul, fear of another night attack, fear that if they stayed, the entire fleet might be lost. So the Navy left, and 11,000 Marines were left behind. They stood on the sand and watched their lifelines shrink into nothing, watched the smoke trails dissolve into the sky, watched the last guarantee of evacuation disappear with the tide. Behind them, supplies lay stacked on the beach, ammunition, food, medical gear. But the unloading had been cut short. Less than half of what was needed had made it ashore. 17 days of rations, 4 days of ammunition, no heavy equipment, no reinforcements, no clear plan to get any of it back. And somewhere beyond the jungle, the Japanese were already moving. The Marines had landed on Guadalcanal 2 days earlier to seize an unfinished airstrip called Henderson Field. It was the key to the southern Pacific. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the skies above the Solomon Islands and the supply lines to Australia beyond them. If the Marines held it, the Japanese advance could be stopped. If they lost it, the Pacific War could tilt decisively the other way. There would be no second landing, no dramatic rescue. Either the Marines held the island, or they died on it. Among the men standing on the beach that morning were teenagers. Private First Class Sidney Phillips was 17 years old when he enlisted, the day after Pearl Harbor. So were most of the men in his mortar platoon. They had trained for war, but none of them had imagined this, watching their own navy sail away while they stayed behind with what they had on their backs. From his command post near Lunga Point, Major General Alexander Vandergrift received the final message from the fleet: all naval forces withdrawing. Vandergrift understood the meaning instantly. He had spent decades studying small wars, jungle fighting, and what happened to isolated forces cut off from resupply. There would be no evacuation plan. There would be no fallback position. He turned to his staff and issued the only order that mattered. Hold the perimeter. Finish the airfield. Make do with what remains. Because from this moment on, Guadalcanal was not a campaign that could be abandoned. It was a place that would be held, or a place where the Marines would die. By the afternoon of August 9th, the reality of Guadalcanal had settled in. The Marines were alone. No fleet offshore, no carrier aircraft overhead, no guarantee that another American ship would return before the Japanese did. Behind the beaches, the supplies were counted and recounted. The numbers never improved. Food for 17 days, if rationed carefully. Ammunition for 4 days, if the fighting was light. Medical supplies already running low. There were no bulldozers to finish Henderson Field. No trucks to move supplies inland. Everything was hauled by hand, through heat that never lifted and humidity that never eased. The airstrip itself was barely an airstrip at all. A rough stretch of coral and dirt carved out of the jungle by Japanese labor units before the invasion. It had been captured intact, but unfinished, exposed, and defenseless. And yet, everything depended on it. If aircraft could fly from Henderson Field, they could protect the island by day. They could attack Japanese ships bringing reinforcements at night. They could turn Guadalcanal from a death trap into a foothold. If the airfield failed, the Marines would be surrounded, bombed, and eventually erased. Every man on the island understood this equation, even if no one said it out loud. Work began immediately. Marines filled bomb craters before they even existed. They hauled ammunition boxes, fuel drums, construction material, whatever could be carried. They worked shirtless, soaked in sweat, skin already breaking down in the tropical air. Japanese bombers appeared the next day. They came from Rabaul, hundreds of miles to the north, flying unopposed. There were no American fighters yet. Anti-aircraft guns were still being emplaced. Bombs fell across Henderson Field, tearing holes in the surface Marines had just finished leveling. Men were killed, filling craters that did not exist an hour earlier. Each time the bombs stopped, the work resumed. Private First Class Sidney Phillips and the men of his mortar platoon were pulled from the line to serve as labor details, digging, carrying, repairing. There was no separation between combat and survival. Everything was survival. Disease began spreading almost immediately: malaria, dysentery, fungal infections, ailments that thrived in heat, filth, and exhaustion. Preventive medicine existed, but rumors spread faster than orders. Some Marines believed the anti-malaria pills caused sterility. Others believed they weakened you. Many quietly spit them out when officers weren't watching. By the end of the campaign, disease would disable more Marines than Japanese bullets ever did. The island itself seemed determined to kill them. The jungle pressed in on the perimeter, thick and dark, alive with movement. At night, sounds came from everywhere: footsteps, splashes, rustling leaves. Sometimes it was Japanese patrols, sometimes wild pigs, sometimes crocodiles sliding through the rivers. Marines learned not to fire at every noise. A single shot could give away a position. A wasted round could not be replaced. They dug foxholes and waited. Meals were reduced to 2 per day. Captured Japanese rice, often crawling with insects, mixed with whatever American rations remained. Men lost weight rapidly. Boots rotted, uniforms tore apart, weapons rusted if not constantly cleaned. Still, the perimeter held. From his command post, Vandergrift watched the situation with clear eyes. He knew the Japanese would not allow an American airfield to survive this close to their defensive perimeter. The only uncertainty was how long it would take them to strike. The Marines had time, measured not in weeks but in days, and somewhere beyond the jungle, an enemy regiment was already loading onto ships. The Japanese attack came at night, exactly as expected, and still almost without warning. On August 21, 1942, just after midnight, Marines along the eastern edge of the perimeter heard movement near the mouth of a shallow river they called Alligator Creek. The name was wrong. The maps were wrong. But the ground itself was unmistakable. A narrow sandbar stretched between the jungle and the sea. It was the only easy crossing point toward Henderson Field from the east. Colonel Clifton Cates had placed his men there for a reason. Machine guns were dug in on the western bank. Riflemen lay behind them in overlapping fields of fire. Artillery batteries from the 11th Marines were already registered on the far side of the creek. If the Japanese tried to cross here, they would have to do it head-on. Shortly after 1:30 a.m., the first shots rang out, then shouting, then screaming. Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar in tight formations, shouting battle cries as they ran. They expected surprise. They expected weak resistance. Instead, they ran straight into prepared American positions. Machine guns opened up at point-blank range. 30-caliber rounds tore into the charging lines. Artillery shells burst among the attackers, canister rounds spraying steel fragments through the darkness. The sandbar became a killing ground. 400 yards away, Private First Class Sidney Phillips crouched with his mortar platoon, listening to the noise without being able to see it. The sound never stopped. Gunfire blended into a constant roar. Explosions shook the ground. Screams rose and fell, then faded. Phillips waited for orders that never came. They weren't needed. The machine guns were doing their work. The Japanese attacked again and again through the night. Each time they were cut down before they could reach the American lines. By dawn, the firing stopped. As the sun rose, Marines moved forward carefully, weapons ready, expecting survivors, traps, or another attack. What they found instead was devastation. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead along the sandbar and in the shallow water beyond it, bodies piled where they had fallen, some still clutching rifles, others tangled together where machine gun fire had caught them mid-charge. Many had been killed only feet from the American positions. The regiment that had attacked, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's advance force, had been almost completely destroyed. Out of more than 900 men, fewer than 30 escaped. The Marines stared at the scene in stunned silence. For months, Japanese forces had advanced everywhere. Singapore, Malaya, the Philippines. They were said to be unstoppable, superior in jungle fighting, night attacks, and morale. That belief died on the sandbar at Alligator Creek, but the victory came with a realization just as sobering. If this was what the Japanese were willing to sacrifice to take Henderson Field, then this battle was only the beginning. Somewhere north of Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders were already preparing their next move, and next time they would not come with 900 men. The Japanese did not need long to understand what Alligator Creek meant. The Marines had not broken, they had not panicked, they had not collapsed, they had annihilated a full regiment and kept Henderson Field running. For Japanese commanders, the conclusion was immediate and deeply unsettling. If the Americans could hold under those conditions, then a larger, smarter attack was required. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was given the task. Unlike Ichiki, Kawaguchi did not believe in frontal assaults against prepared positions. He had studied American doctrine. He knew the Marines relied on firepower, artillery coordination, and fixed defenses. So he planned to go where the Americans believed no attack could come from: the jungle south of Henderson Field. There, a narrow ridge rose out of the trees, the only high ground between the airfield and the dense interior of Guadalcanal. If Japanese forces seized it, they could bring artillery within a few hundred yards of the runway. Henderson Field would become unusable within hours. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson saw the danger immediately. Edson was not a conventional officer. He had spent years fighting guerrillas in Nicaragua. He understood night combat, infiltration, and the psychology of men under pressure. Standing on the ridge with General Vandergrift's operations officer, Edson pointed at the ground beneath his boots. "If they come from the south," he said, "they will come here." He asked for permission to hold the ridge with his Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion, fewer than 900 men in total. Vandergrift approved without hesitation. On September 11th, Edson's men moved into position. They dug shallow foxholes along the narrow crest. They positioned machine guns with overlapping fields of fire. They registered artillery targets on every approach. There was little barbed wire, little cover, and no room to retreat. On the night of September 12th, the jungle came alive. Japanese artillery opened the attack, shells crashing into the ridgeline. Then, rifle fire echoed from the darkness below. Moments later, Japanese soldiers charged uphill in screaming waves. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Marines fired until barrels overheated. Machine guns hammered until belts ran dry. Grenades were thrown, picked up, and thrown back again. In some positions, Japanese soldiers reached the foxholes. There was no room for maneuver. Men fought with bayonets, rifle butts, knives, and entrenching tools in complete darkness. Edson moved along the line under fire, shouting orders, refusing to take cover. His presence mattered. Men who saw him standing upright stayed in their holes and kept firing. The Marines were pushed back in places. Positions collapsed. Lines bent and reformed again and again along the ridge. Artillery fire from the 11th Marines fell dangerously close to friendly lines, shells exploding just yards in front of American foxholes. The ground shook continuously. At dawn, there was a brief lull. Wounded were dragged to the rear. Ammunition was redistributed by hand. The dead were left where they lay. That night, the Japanese came again. This time, they came closer. They reached within 50 yards of Edson's command post. For a moment, the ridge seemed ready to break. Marines fell back to a final defensive line. There would be no further withdrawal. If this line failed, Henderson Field would fall with it. The fighting reached a pitch few men ever experienced again. Noise became constant. Individual shots blurred into a single endless roar. In one position, a Marine who ran out of ammunition beat a Japanese soldier to death with his helmet. At dawn, on September 14th, the attack stopped. The Japanese were gone. More than 600 lay dead on the slopes below the ridge. Hundreds more were wounded, many dying unseen in the jungle. Edson's force had suffered heavy losses, but the ridge was still in American hands. The Marines named it Bloody Ridge. Others called it Edson's Ridge. Either name was earned. When the sun rose fully, the men sat in their foxholes, too exhausted to speak. Some laughed, some cried. Most stared silently at the torn ground in front of them. They had held. And in doing so, they had forced the Japanese high command to confront an impossible truth. Guadalcanal was not collapsing, it was becoming stronger. By October, the Japanese had accepted a brutal reality. As long as Henderson Field existed, Guadalcanal could not be retaken. Japanese ground attacks had failed, night assaults had failed, the jungle had not saved them. So the Imperial Navy was brought in to do what the Army could not. On the night of October 14, 1942, two Japanese battleships approached Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. Congo, Haruna. Each carried 14-inch guns, weapons designed to destroy enemy fleets, not airstrips carved out of coral. At 1:30 in the morning, they opened fire. The first shells hit Henderson Field with a force the Marines had never experienced. This was not artillery as they knew it. This was something else entirely. Each shell weighed nearly a ton. Each impact sent shockwaves through the ground, lifting men out of their foxholes and slamming them back down. The noise was beyond description. The earth itself seemed to tear apart. Trees exploded into splinters. Fuel dumps ignited, sending pillars of flame into the sky. Aircraft were destroyed where they sat, ripped open by blast and shrapnel. Marines pressed themselves into the bottoms of their holes and waited for the next impact. Some prayed, some screamed, some lost all sense of time. For 83 minutes, the bombardment continued. Nearly 1,000 shells fell on the airfield. When the firing finally stopped, Henderson Field was unrecognizable. The runway was cratered and torn apart. Pierced steel planking lay twisted across the ground. Ammunition dumps smoldered. 48 aircraft had been destroyed. At first light, Japanese commanders believed the problem had been solved. No airfield, no aircraft, no resistance from the sky. They were wrong. As soon as the shelling ended, Marines and engineers emerged from their foxholes and went back to work. They filled craters with coral and dirt. They dragged steel planking into place. They patched holes while smoke still drifted across the field. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just men moving because they knew what would happen if they stopped. By noon, aircraft could take off, barely. By evening, they could land. Henderson Field was operational again. The Japanese could not understand it. They had used battleships. They had used the heaviest naval guns available. And still, the Americans were flying. Those aircraft became known as the Cactus Air Force, named for the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. They flew whatever could still get airborne, Wildcats with patched wings, dauntless dive bombers held together with scavenged parts, pilots who flew until exhaustion or malaria forced them out of the cockpit. Fuel was siphoned from wrecks. Spare parts were stripped from destroyed planes. Nothing was wasted. Every Marine on Guadalcanal understood the equation clearly. If Henderson Field lived, they lived. If it died, they died. The bombardment had failed to break them, and now the Japanese prepared their final ground offensive. The final Japanese offensive began in darkness. On the night of October 23, 1942, more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers moved into positions south of Henderson Field. They had marched for days through swamp and jungle, hauling artillery by hand, dragging wounded with them, surviving on half rations. Many were already sick. Many were already exhausted. But they believed this attack would end the campaign. Japanese commanders were certain the Marines were near collapse. They believed Henderson Field had been neutralized. They believed one final blow would break American resistance. The assault was planned in waves. First, diversionary attacks to draw Marine reserves away from the south. Then, a main thrust straight into the perimeter, aimed at overrunning the airfield itself. Shortly after midnight, the jungle erupted. Artillery fire crashed into Marine positions. Machine guns opened up along the line. Flares turned the darkness into harsh, shifting daylight. Japanese infantry charged through gaps in the terrain, some units advancing shoulder to shoulder, others infiltrating in small groups, slipping through the trees. The Marines met them with everything they had left: rifle fire, machine guns, mortars fired at minimum range, shells exploding almost as soon as they left the tube. At several points, Japanese soldiers broke into the perimeter. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted again in the dark. Foxholes changed hands more than once. Officers and NCOs rallied scattered men, forming new lines wherever the old ones collapsed. Private First Class Sidney Phillips fired mortar rounds until his hands blistered. When ammunition ran low, men carried shells forward under fire, passing them hand to hand. There was no room for panic. Behind the Marines, Henderson Field lay only a few hundred yards away. If the line failed here, it would fail everywhere. The fighting continued through the night and into the next day. Japanese attacks came in waves, each one smaller than the last. By the third night, the pattern was unmistakable. The Japanese were running out of strength, their artillery fire slackened, their attacks lost coordination. Wounded soldiers were left where they fell, unable to be evacuated. American artillery and air power now worked together seamlessly. As soon as daylight came, aircraft from Henderson Field struck Japanese assembly areas and supply routes. Ships attempting to reinforce the island were attacked from the air and turned back or sunk. The jungle that had once concealed Japanese movements now trapped them. By October 26th, the offensive collapsed. Japanese units withdrew into the interior, fragmented and starving. Thousands died in the weeks that followed, not from combat, but from disease, hunger, and exhaustion. For the first time since the war began, a major Japanese offensive had failed completely. The Marines did not celebrate. They were too tired, too thin, too changed. They had survived something few units ever endured, and they understood even then that Guadalcanal had marked a turning point. Japan would never again attack with this kind of strength. The initiative in the Pacific had shifted, and it had shifted because a force that should have been destroyed had refused to give way. The fighting on. Guadalcanal did not end with a surrender. It ended quietly. By November, Japanese forces on the island were no longer attacking. They were hiding, starving, dying in the jungle. Their supply routes had been cut, their air cover destroyed, their ability to reinforce shattered. In February 1943, under cover of darkness, the Japanese evacuated what remained of their forces from Guadalcanal. More than 20,000 had landed on the island, fewer than half left it alive. When the evacuation was complete, the Marines did not cheer. There were no victory parades, no celebrations. Most were too weak to stand for long. Men who had arrived strong and confident now weighed 40 pounds less. Malaria lingered in their blood. Dysentery had hollowed them out. Many would carry the physical effects of Guadalcanal for the rest of their lives. Some carried worse. Sidney Phillips survived the campaign. So did many of the men he trained with. Others did not. They were buried where they fell, or at sea, or never found at all. General Vandergrift was later asked how the Marines had held when logic said they should have been destroyed. He did not talk about courage. He did not talk about heroism. He said they held because there was no alternative. Guadalcanal was the first time Japan had been forced to retreat, the first time its expansion had been stopped and reversed. It did not end the war, but it changed its direction. From that point forward, Japan would fight defensively. The Allies would advance, island by island, at enormous cost. That path began here, not with overwhelming strength, not with perfect planning, but with exhausted men holding a broken airstrip long after they had been written off. On the morning the Navy sailed away, the Marines did not know any of this. They did not know Guadalcanal would become a turning point. They did not know their stand would be studied for generations. They only knew one thing: they were still there. And as long as they were still there, the island had not been lost. That is what they held on Guadalcanal. Not just ground, but time, momentum, and the first fragile hope that the Pacific War could still be won. If you found this story worth remembering, thank you for remembering it.